Is the story going to make sense if we cut it? I do prefer Regency and Victorian eras. It's really that human element and seeing how they interpreted and responded. My ultimate goal is for them to feel good about the final product. So if you're sucking the joy out of it, don't do it.
Hello and welcome to this Regency History interview where I talk to writers, authors of fiction and non-fiction, and also editors, and I'm hoping in the future some readers as well. I'm particularly excited today to be talking to Jennia D'Lima, who is an editor. So it's the first time I've had a chance to talk to an editor of historical fiction. My name's Andrew Knowles, part of the Regency History team. And yeah, so thank you, Jennia, for being willing to speak to me from the USA. And editing. I mean, editing is part of the book process, but what actually is editing?
Great. So editing is a little more complicated than just a one-line definition or a quick answer. There are different levels of editing. And the first one is usually developmental editing, and that looks at the big picture elements like plot holes, inconsistencies, characters, character arcs, all that sort of thing, the flow and the pacing. That's primarily what I do, as well as line editing, which looks at the rhythm and the flow of each line. And also are these words that the characters themselves would use. So you want to see some variance there too, based off the characters and their backgrounds and even their age.
Wow, there's so many things in there you just said there. I mean, flow and pacing and arcs, and yeah, it all sounds quite intense, doesn't it? Well, it does to me anyway. I mean, I have, dare I say, I have edited a couple of books that my wife's written, so I'm not entirely unfamiliar with the process, but it must require a lot of knowledge. And I guess if you're editing historical fiction, what difference does that make?
Oh, it makes a huge difference. And I think part of that is having the knowledge ahead of time before you go in about what to expect from something from that time period. Do you have any prior understanding of what life was like then? Because it also helps you pick out what in here doesn't fit, what's an anachronism, without having to search up every single thing. So that's one reason why I strongly suggest people read classics, books written during the time periods they're writing in. It just helps you get a better feel for the wording used and the way people interacted in social conventions instead of just trying to wing it and hope that you got it right.
So are there particular time periods that you specialize in?
I have done a bit of everything from the Sumerians to the 1990s.
Okay, that's pretty widespread.
And there have obviously been some where I've had to do a lot more research than others just because I'm not as familiar, but I do prefer Regency and Victorian eras. That's just my personal area that I enjoy reading about and that I find fascinating. So I don't have to do as much of that research and legwork myself. You know, a lot of things will just sort of ping, this isn't correct.
Yeah, because the question there is when you're researching, I mean, well, how do you research? How much do you prepare? If someone says to you, I'm going to send you a book about, or you agree to do a book about, let's say Roman Britain.
So I do look up a lot of primary resources whenever possible. And partially that's because it becomes like a game of telephone. Otherwise, you're reading someone else's interpretations. And then depending on how far removed we are now from that time period, you could be reading 30 to 40 interpretations of this original work. So who knows how much accuracy is still there, which is why, again, I always try and go back as far as possible and read these things. And the internet's been great for that.
So you say original sources. So let's come back to the period that you said you enjoy doing, Victorian and Regency. So where do you go for original sources for that?
A lot of the counties in England now have a bunch of their resources online, you know, paperwork that's been filed or county registers with where, you know, births and deaths have been recorded, that sort of thing. And even the notes that are in there, the notes can be very interesting and can lead you down a whole nother rabbit hole. But if you can find journals, diaries, letters, that sort of thing, anything where there's more of a human element to it and it's not just a history textbook. Because yes, you do need to know the history as well, at least to a certain degree, depending upon what you're writing. But it's really that human element and seeing how they interpreted and responded to the events that, in my opinion, are what make that period that period. Just sort of like how we respond now to TikTok and how we just take it all in. sort of the same thing versus how they might feel about going on a walk in the park.
Let's talk about the language that people use and the phrases. How often do you read something and something pings and you think, actually, I'm not sure if that, let's say, that particular expression was used at that time?
Right. Yes, I've just had something like that. There were a few words and phrases that I knew just from prior reading weren't invented yet, such as socialite being used in the late 1700s. And I think it was pull oneself up by their bootstraps, which I think, again, that was early 1900s when you really start to see it come into fashion. So both of those are in there. And I've had books before, not language so much, but more a fact. Actually, I've had a couple now where people in Jane Austen's time period are speaking openly about Jane Austen as a writer and praising her work, which of course wouldn't have been accurate because she posted. So a couple of times I've had to go through and link sources there and explain, well, this, wouldn't have happened.
Yes, it's easy to, because we think of Jane Austen as being, the
Right.
preeminent author of the time, but of course there were many other authors who were much more. I mean, Maria Edgeworth just comes to mind, and Fanny Burney, people like that, who were much more visible at the time.
Yes, and there's something interesting I read recently, and it was talking about how even though she's considered, I think, one of the top 10 authors now of all time, they had an assembly of people put together who specialized in literature, and they changed some of the wording in the beginning of Pride and Prejudice to see who would pick it up. And only one out of the 12 realized that it was a very, very slightly doctored version of the opening paragraphs of Pride and Prejudice. So, I mean, I think that shows too, yes, we have this familiarity with her and we admire her, but we also might not be as familiar with her as we think we are.
Yeah, I do wonder how many readers and authors of historical romances who say they love Jane Austen, how many of them actually read very much actual Jane
Right.
Austen?
Or maybe they've seen all the film adaptations and they love those and they love Colin Firth.
Well, absolutely, and that's great, and it's great that they do that. And but I would encourage people to read original Jane Austen as well. I mean, it's quite accessible, but it's not as accessible as you might think. I know I've found some of it quite hard work. So, how important do you think is historical accuracy to readers? What do you think readers make of a book being accurate or not?
Depends so much on the audience because, you see Bridgerton, which is just exploding in popularity, and they're pretty easygoing about historical accuracy. I made the comparison recently. It's sort of like Debrett's versus Burke's peerage. So, do you want one that's very, very fact based, or one that maybe goes off the rails a little bit and shoot, this could have happened? We think maybe this is what we occurred. But yeah, it all becomes down to the audience. There are some that they're really just looking for a fancy dress romance, and that's fine. And then there are others that are going to nitpick every single anachronism that you include in your book, and that's going to lead to a 1-star review because they're expecting that. So part of that is just the marketing and how you put forth your novel and also how you write your back cover copy. Let them know ahead of time what they can expect so there aren't any allusions to otherwise.
What would your process be? So, someone hands you a Regency romance, for example. What are the sort of big steps to look out for in the process?
So my very first step is I read it first as a reader. And I have to do that fairly quickly because otherwise I just start going into editing mode whether I want to or not. So I'll speed read through it and think, is there anything that stands out to me? Is there anything that doesn't feel quite right and doesn't seem to gel with the rest of the storyline? Are there any moments where maybe the characters don't act like someone of that period would act? I'm not saying that's not allowed. When a character acts in a way that is dissimilar from what we would expect, some reasoning as to why is helpful there. Show us what it is about this person that's different from the other people around them. Then I go through and I edit my first round, and I'll do that 2 times just to make sure I haven't missed anything. I'll highlight anything that I'm uncertain of that first read through. I go through, I look up everything possible. I have resources sitting by my desk, resources saved online that I look through. I look through some of those resources I mentioned earlier just to double check also sometimes too. And then I'll include links whenever possible just so an author doesn't think that I'm just being argumentative in some way or it's not a personal preference. This really is the word that was used.
Yeah, I mean, I guess while you're editing someone's work, you are also handling somebody's ego to a certain extent,
Yes,
aren't
so
you?
it's important to be gentle.
So how do you give the feedback? Do you speak to them? Do you send them documents? How does that work?
It depends a little bit on the person. There are, and partially too, that's whatever the author prefers. If they want to have a Zoom meeting, we'll have a Zoom meeting, a phone call, but the bulk of what I send back to them will be written. So I make changes in the document. I'm not going to send them something and say, I felt that this scene fell flat. I'll write in the document and the comments over on the side, here is where this maybe could be cut. Here's where we need a little more liveliness happening, or here's where her reaction doesn't seem to match her internal narrative. Notes along those lines. And then I also will have a written up editorial summary that goes along with that and touches on each of the big picture elements a little more in depth.
And so, when you're working with an author, do you typically have multiple state rounds of edits, or is it just one?
I always
One
do
take
at
on it?
least two. And if they would like to have a third, we can do a third too. I've had some authors who will ask for beyond a third round, and I'm happy to accommodate that as well, since my ultimate goal is for them to feel
Yeah.
good about the final product. It's not me cutting them off and saying, no, we're done.
Yeah, and a question I meant to ask you actually early on, but the whole sound thing distracted me. So, do you use resources like Google Books, for example? You talked about looking at journals and
Mhm.
diaries. Yeah. Um,
Yes, I do. And then Google Scholar also. And actually, one of the books that I really like, and it's a little beat up looking, I don't know if it'll show, the Oxford Dictionary of Slang.
okay.
Because you do have a lot of phrases that will come up, and it's much easier just look it up in there and have proof immediately. Okay, 1947 is when it's
Yeah.
coined, instead of just saying, I don't think that sounds right. So I do refer to that a lot because I think so many of these phrases have just become such an integrated part of our own language that we maybe don't think about them. We just use them without even considering
Yeah.
that perhaps they haven't been around that long.
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to dialogue, what do you think the author's approach should be to dialogue? Because obviously you want to be historically accurate, but if you wrote the dialogue in a historically accurate form, well, firstly, could you write the dialogue in a historically? We don't really know how they spoke because we have no recordings. Let's say of the Regency or Victorian periods. Let's talk about those particularly. But also, how accessible would that be to the modern audience?
Right, that's a really good question, and one that I enjoy going through too, though, because it is a little bit of a challenge, but at the same time, if you read enough books from those periods, you can see like a pattern in the language and how they speak to each other and phrases that would maybe come up more often. But no, it's never going to be exactly the same. And part of that too is even words they may have used at the time. I will sometimes highlight those and recommend a different choice just because to a modern reader it's going to sound odd, or they might not understand it without some sort of context given. And we don't want to have to provide a definition within the framework of the novel because that immediately pulls you out of the story. Again, one of the characters isn't going to have to define something to another character because they would just inherently know.
Absolutely, yes.
It's sort of like we're taking that historical language and then filtering it through a modern viewpoint, but retaining some of the essence of it.
Sounds like quite a challenge to do, a challenge to achieve.
It's a bit like art, they have those parameters of I know it when I see it.
Yes.
It's, and I think it's sort of the same thing, like the cadence will sound off or something like that when you read it out loud to yourself, and you're able to kind of go through and pinpoint with a little more accuracy that way, again, because you have that familiarity in that background.
So when it comes to historical facts, are there common errors that you see quite a few authors making?
So I haven't seen any errant chipmunks walking in parks, which I know is a
That
maybe not
happens,
a pet
yes.
peeve, but one that pops up. I think reading the Jane Austen one that we talked about briefly earlier, that one has come up more than any other that I've seen. A lot of it also is just wording, or maybe we'll have ideas based on our own worldview now, and people will apply them to characters who lived back then when it would have been extremely unlikely to feel that way. Our views on women and feminism were much, much different then than they are now. And so taking, not to the extremes, to the level that we would expect someone to feel now, obviously wouldn't happen then. And so sometimes I see that come up with characters where they're fighting for equal rights and these sorts of things, and it just doesn't feel accurate for that time period. They might have wanted to enjoy a more equal, harmonious household or not be treated like chattel, but at the same time, they're not going to be going to the same standards of treatment that we would expect.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there were women back then who were very much supporting the rights of women, but you're right,
Right.
not using the language that we would use today. And in the same way, attitudes to things like slavery and people's place in society. I mean, I read a book about being a servant the other day, but it was a book about housekeeping in grand houses, written by a cook and the butler. They were a married couple, and the opening of the book was very much, if you're a servant, that's the position that God's put you in.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they thought that it was all divinely appointed to them. It wasn't, I should fight the system. And I think about that one line from Monty Python, come see the violence inherent in the system. They didn't really, it wasn't a viewpoint that they held for the most part.
So have you ever considered actually being an author yourself?
No. I used to write when I was younger, and I wrote quite a bit, but I don't think I could go through all the work an author has to go through to see their book from start to finish. It seems like a monumental task, and I applaud every single one of them for following through and committing to it and going through all of the steps necessary. I just don't think that is for me.
Yeah, I mean, I see my wife going through the process. I mean, right now she's going through the process of plotting one book and doing the final edits of another, and it's hours and hours and hours of commitment. So yes, we applaud authors who do that, but also the role of editors as well in that. There's a good question there. Should I have one editor or should I have multiple editors?
I highly suggest having more than one editor, and I know there is a psychological term for this and I'm forgetting it, but it's something about how when we look at our own work, our brain fills in what it expects to see. And so it's the same thing for an editor who's gone through your work multiple times, which is why at the very least I would suggest having someone do that heavier developmental and line edit side, and then hire a separate person to be the proofreader. Because by that point, I'm now familiar with the work. I read it a minimum of 6 times. I'm going to start filling in where there should have been a comma or a period because I expect to see it just as much as the author does, or I know what they're getting at. And so if something maybe doesn't quite follow through the way that it should, I'm already filling in those blanks as well. So having that other person go through and make their changes, or maybe highlight something that to them doesn't read as quite as fluid as it could, is very helpful.
But I guess you're also going to have different opinions. So if you've got two different editors, you've got different points of view.
Yeah, I do see most editors, though, saying or suggesting that you hire more than one editor, and a lot of them will not touch a work if they've already worked on it substantially. And some of them will actually encourage you to hire more than just the two. They'll say, have someone do developmental, another person who does line, then copy editing, and then proofreading. And then, of course, you get to send it to formatting.
And I can already hear a lot of authors going, that's expensive.
Yes, it is, unfortunately. And I try very hard, especially if authors are self-publishing, to meet them where they can afford it, because I personally just have strong feelings about, I don't think that your bank balance should be a barrier of entry into being able to publish your work and have a polished final product.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, if you're writing a novel and putting it out there, you're putting out there something which will well, it's effectively timeless, particularly if it's not a contemporary novel.
Right.
Particularly if it's a historical novel and you're referencing the past, and it could be as valid in 20, 50, 100 years time as it is today. So how much do you invest into that?
Yeah, and so I have seen people say that you should treat it like a business, because it is a business. And it's just like any other business. Are you going to buy a storefront and then not pay money to have a sign and advertising? Or are you not going to pay to have marketing and an editor who goes through and polishes it for you? And it's sort of the same mentality, but I think part of it too, just some people are content. I wrote my book, I published it, I'm done, and that's okay. I'm not going to push somebody to do something that they're not ready to do, because also you're not going to convince someone by laying out your outline for why you should hire an editor. If they've already made that decision, they've made that decision, and that's fine too.
Yeah, absolutely. Often authors do a lot of research into the history themselves, and they inevitably want to share quite a lot of the facts that they've learned. How do they avoid turning their novel into, or at least parts of the novel, into a history book, doing what I refer to, I think other people refer to as a history dump, where
Yes,
suddenly
an
you're
info dump.
how do you avoid that?
I do a lot of pruning with some people that I work with because, again, there is that excitement about this was just so fascinating, I have to include it. And a couple of times I've recommended if you are really that passionate about sharing it, perhaps we can have an author's note at the end and you can share some of your historical research there and show why it's based on fact. And I think that's an appropriate place for it because it's like you said, the reader, when they're going through, they don't want to read 10 pages about this war and why the colonel was fighting in this war and how many miles did his horse travel every single day. So part of it is just seeing what is moving the plot forward, what's related to the characters in a way that is completely necessary. Does this have to be there? Is the story going to make sense if we cut it?
Yeah, because it's just so easy to want to share what you've learned.
Yeah, it's kind of like a word vomit on the page.
But on the other hand, what makes a historical novel is the fact that it is deeply entrenched in history. So how do you get that balance right between talking about the stuff that's going to appeal to the reader who actually wants to learn something as well as just be entertained?
Part of that is being able to add those facts or those pieces that a reader could pick the book up and be able to figure out what time period it's set in without you having to tell them. They shouldn't have to flip to the back cover and say, oh, 1812, got it. So just thinking about the way they interact with each other, the way the household is set up, even everyday items they might use, recreational activities, obviously dress is an important one, especially with romance. And usually the readers can parse out a rough time period just based off of those things. And so they'll be able to tell, Regency versus Victorian versus the 1920s from those inclusions. But you don't have to sit there and give them paragraphs of information about the year was 1922 and enter Mildred.
When it comes to high quality historical fiction, are you able to give give your opinion on authors who produce the high quality historical fiction, the sort of authors that you might want to read in order to learn how they do it?
Yeah, there are a few Christian authors that I really, really enjoy who do an exemplary job. Let's see, Kimberly Duffy is one. I think I have one of her books actually right here. I do. Yeah, Kimberly Duffy, all of hers have been just amazing. And she usually has characters also going to India and then back to England or vice versa. And hers are incredibly well researched and just beautifully written as well. And the characters are very three-dimensional and feel fleshed out like real people. But she also includes a lot of information that you don't see in a lot of other work either, which I think is what sets her apart. And then Elizabeth Camden is another one that I really like. I'm just gonna see. All I have is the photo of the book that I took, but
Right.
Roseanne White is one that I really, really love also. I don't usually remember names and titles of books I've read that much, and I think it's because I become so focused on what I'm working on that I can tell you a little more intimately and in detail about those stories and books that I just read for pleasure, where I try to not completely focus on them because otherwise it does become overwhelming and you start to nitpick.
Just out of curiosity, what sort of books does an editor read for pleasure?
I read a bit of everything, but that's just me. So I do read probably about half fiction and half nonfiction. Then I'm trying to think. I had one that was about the history of skirts that was actually really interesting, and just random things like there was a book about the history of salt. But these books that maybe on the surface you think, oh, that can't be that exciting. But reading about how it came about and why we have things the way that we have them and why they're in certain parts of the world and not in other parts of the world, and how it all kind of goes back to, again, historical details. And we just take it as a matter of fact part of life. This is the way it's always been.
So it sounds like you enjoy reading history generally.
Yes, I do. So there was probably a 2 or 3 year period where I think I only read historical fiction. And then in high school, I almost primarily read classics.
So here's a question that might be a challenge. Do you need to have a love of history and an interest in history in order to be able to write historical fiction?
I think so. You hear that phrase about write what you know, but I think it's write what you love because you're going to be with this manuscript for a very long time. If you don't enjoy it and you don't have that keen interest, it's going to feel like torture. You're going you're going to go through multiple rounds with your editor and then have to show a deep commitment to getting this book out there and having it published, but it also has your name on it. So it should be something that you feel strongly about and that you genuinely love. Otherwise, why are you writing it?
That is a good question, but the one about names. I mean, where do you stand on pseudonyms and putting a different name on your book?
I have no problem with that at all, and it's especially helpful if you write under different genres, and that's you're going to have a different market. And so there was a study once that was showing that people like to read what they like to read, and they tend to read a lot of the same. And so it's sort of like the whole idea about Regency fiction. A lot of people will say like, oh, Pride and Prejudice retelling, it's on my TBR. And they'll pick up every Pride and Prejudice retelling and read all of them. Or someone might like a small town romance, and so that tends to be what they gravitate toward, and they want more of the same. It's kind of like that idea of I know what I like. And so that way it helps differentiate between this market that you are appealing to here versus this market here where perhaps they are expecting, an enemies to lovers romance and they pick it up and it's sci-fi and they're just like, nope, hate it. And it's not because it's bad or it's poorly written, it's just they are not the right audience for it. And that's why a pseudonym is extremely helpful.
Are Regency romances historical fiction?
They can be. I think that the lines cutting through are very fuzzy sometimes, and one of the examples I think about a lot is: are you reading a Sense and Sensibility retelling that is still set in the Regency period, or are you reading Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, which it does have Regency era historical details, but obviously is not factual in most ways, but it still has all the trappings of what we associate with that time period.
Yes, and you mentioned Bridgerton earlier on, and obviously Bridgerton looks like it's Regency.
Yes.
But anyone who knows much about the Regency doesn't have to look very closely to see that it's really quite not Regency.
It's a bit like, what is it, A Knight's Tale or something, I think, with Heath Ledger. It was sort of the same thing. I remember going in completely unaware of what that movie was about, apart from the movie posters. And then, what is it, like rock music starts playing or something. I just thought, what is happening? So I think part of it is the expectation going in is what really matters. If you go in realizing this, it's probably, you're not going to have that moment of being jarred out of it.
So if you're speaking to, and I'm sure you do speak to authors on a regular basis, or people who are thinking about becoming about an author of historical fiction, what are some of your top tips for somebody who's thinking of going down this route?
Oh, wow. So the first would be to start off researching before you commit to fully writing the manuscript. Otherwise, you're going to be bouncing back and forth a lot. You're just going to be slogging through all these details and going back through your manuscript over and over again. Oh, no, did I get that correct? I mean, then part of that might even be you name a place that doesn't exist for 10 years. You might have someone going to Bath in a resort, but it's like the 1600s. Or, they're dying from A disease when maybe the vaccine has been invented by that point, and that probably wouldn't have happened. Just all these sorts of details. So if you know that you want something to be a central plot point, especially, go into that and research it, because you don't want to find out too late into the process that your entire plot and outline has to be thrown out the window or altered to great effect and time on the author's part. It's just easier to go ahead of time and look up these things and make sure that they're where you think they are. So that's the first one. So my second would also be, again, what we were talking about a little bit before. Make sure this really is something that you're passionate about and you feel strongly about, that you feel there's a reason that this book needs to be on the market, or this is a story that you are really in love with and that you can see yourself loving and wanting to share with people for years. Because especially for self-published authors, it will be up to you to be sharing it for years. So you need to have that drive. And then the third one would be to really open yourself up to everything from that time period, because it's amazing what you don't know. And the only way to find those things out is to really just dive in and go through books and music and all the other accoutrements that we associate with some era, the cultural pieces. And going to museums too is actually extremely helpful. Seeing some of these things in real life and seeing them to scale. And I think it just gives you a better understanding of how everything worked together. And that filters through in the writing as well. It doesn't feel like a misplaced object. It's just sort of jammed in there to be jammed in there and look historically accurate. And it's hard to explain, but you can sort of understand when someone knows what they're doing and they understand what these objects were used for and why they were important, versus I'm going to have a carriage sitting outside because I feel like I should have a carriage sitting outside.
Yeah, it's good to do the background reading, isn't it? And to read other novels written in the same genre, the same time period, and to try and see how
And
those
the
authors.
historical houses of the time period too. I really enjoy going to the historical homes that are kept up and maintained, because I think it also helps you too, especially when you're like, if you're going to have a book that's mostly domestic in a domestic setting and it's one family and another family comes to visit or back and forth, just being able to see the space and the size of each of the rooms and how the homes were mostly laid out generally, and how you would get from one room to another, it can just be very helpful and help, and that little bit extra of accuracy that just really makes it come alive and feel like a real place and time.
Yes, yes. One feature of sort of old historic houses that I didn't really appreciate until gave it some thought was actually older houses don't have corridors. The
Mm-hmm.
corridor wasn't a thing. One room led onto the next room, onto the next room. They hadn't even. So if you talk about a corridor in a book in the 1600s,
Right.
probably didn't exist. There wasn't the concept wasn't
Yeah.
a thing.
And the people working there are so knowledgeable about these fine little minute details that
Yeah,
maybe just we don't even think about.
yeah.
And one example is, we went to Shakespeare's house, and my younger daughter was wearing a shirt with a fuzzy fox on it. And they they were holding out these sisals that they would use, sort of like we would use a lint brush. And my younger daughter, who was 5 at the time, said, "Brush my fox." And so we ended up getting a live demonstration of how these thistles would work to roll the lint off your clothes as they brushed the fox off on her shirt.
Wow, wow. So that's history in action, isn't it?
Yes, and so I'm just, I guess glad that my child has no barriers for talking to people, but it was really fascinating. And I think it's different too, in seeing someone hold up an item and say, we use this item for such and such. Yeah, versus actually seeing the item in use and see how they did it.
When you're talking to an author, what would your advice be or your thoughts be if they say, well, should I plot it out in detail first and then write it, or should I just write it and go with the flow?
Oh, the whole plotter versus pantser debate.
Yep, that's the
I
one.
say whatever goes for you, because I've worked with both and I can't really say that there's a difference as far as the finished product. Just whatever works better for them is what they should stick to. And I don't believe that they should force themselves into following the guidelines of one person over another, because you know what works best for you and how you are best able to focus and work. And I know some people who are more the fly by the seat of your pants type people have said that when they have to write all those details out, they get over the story quicker. It's no longer exciting for them. They want to see where it goes just as much as the reader is going to want to see where it goes. And so when they force themselves to write that all out, it just takes all the joy out of it.
Yeah.
So if you're sucking the joy out of it, don't do it.
And if an author thinks, actually, I'd quite like to be an editor for other people's work,
Mm-hmm.
what would your advice be there? How do you get started as being an editor?
Well, it differs. One recommendation would be just to start off with family and friends, because they're probably going to be a little more honest in their advice and help you see if that's a career path that's a good choice for you, a good fit. And make sure that you like being alone a lot. This is why I have 2 dogs. Yeah, part of it isn't just the workload itself, but the personality you need to have in order to be an editor, because again, it's not just the isolation a little bit, but finding other net editors and networking with them and talking to them and sharing ideas is extremely beneficial as well. And it gives you a little bit of that I have friends in the profession feeling, even if you mostly just chat online. But it helps also having someone else to bounce those ideas off of, or when you get stuck somewhere maybe, or Word is acting up and not cooperating with you, being able to ask someone and get an answer quickly.
Software, is there any particular software that you use as an editor?
I primarily just use Word, but I also use Excel for things like invoicing. So I use Word with track changes. I have worked in Google Docs before, but you have a lot more open to you with Word and being able to add comments and so on and change style and things like that. So I prefer Word.
So you're saying you use Word, and you're saying you use it for track changes and stuff like that, which is great. That's a great feature within Word. Do you use it for things like grammar recommendations?
No.
Why not?
It's often wrong, especially with historical information. It will flag everything and say, did you really mean this? Did you want this word to be this word, when you might be using, a word used in a different way than it is used now, and Word will not like that.
So it's very much down to the human editor to be checking those things rather than relying upon the digital
Right.
tools.
Yes, because Word and Grammarly and those sorts of software packages, they don't pick up context, and they're going to miss that. Or even if you're using, words in another language for some reason, which, would be common with historical novels. Obviously, Word's not going to pick those up either, and it's going to flag them and say, this is wrong. Did you really mean whatever? And just as an example, one of our cats is named Kipling after Rudyard Kipling, and Word autocorrects her name to Killing every single time. If anyone's interested in joining a Victorian book club, there's one on Instagram, which is one that I recommend to anyone who's interested in writing historical fiction, just because they do dive deeply into some of these details or things that people miss.
So how can they find that?
The woman in charge is read.write.janis, Janis, and it's the Victorian Sensationalist Book Club. So we read a lot of Wilkie Collins, but we just read Jane Eyre, which was, there you go, a Regency book written in past the Regency time period. So it's just very fun, and getting to interact with people and see the different viewpoints now also, and how people see some of these things now and interpret it, and then someone has another edition which might have annotations, and they're able to explain like, oh, well, my book actually explained that it's because of this and this. It's a more fun way maybe to read the classics than what we were given in high school. Well,
that's always a good idea, making classics more fun. So where can people find you online, Jennia?
So my website is just jenniaedits.com. And then I'm also on Instagram and Twitter under Jennia Ahava, which is JenniaAhava.
Well, it's been great talking to you. You've given me lots of insights into the editing process, and I trust that other people watching this and listening to this will also have learned a great deal about how editing works in the world of historical fiction, and be inspired to think about editing and that process, and using an editor if they don't already do that. So thank you very much for your time. It's been great to have a conversation with you, Jennia.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you.